The Nancy Drew Files, Case Number 1, Secrets Can Kill by Carolyn Keene. Chapter 16. Ned turned the car smoothly onto Bedford Road, heading toward the high school. Then he glanced over at Nancy, who was frowning in concentration. "Do you really think Mitch Dillon would kill Daryl?" "I just don't know," Nancy admitted. "Who can say for sure?" She felt uncomfortable just thinking about it. On Friday night, in the parking lot, she'd spent almost 45 minutes convincing Daryl to see things her way. By helping her put Mitch Dillon behind bars, she'd said Daryl would be easing his conscience, and it might help him out of some of the trouble he'd gotten himself into. She'd told Daryl that he didn't have much to lose either. It had been easy enough to say then, when she was persuading Daryl to go along with her plan. But Monday was 3 days later, and in a few short hours they'd be putting that plan into action. It was a good plan, Nancy knew, but no plan was foolproof. And if something went wrong, Daryl would be the one to pay the price. Sensing her worry, Ned reached over and squeezed her hand. His class load was light for the next few days, and he'd decided to stay to help out. "Hey," he said gently, "everything's going to be fine. I'll be there. George and Bess and Alan will be there. Even the police are coming. And you're way ahead of the game where they're concerned. You've already solved the case, and they're still scratching their heads about it." "Well, I had a head start on them, plus a very important piece of evidence." Nancy began to feel better. "Besides, I do need them. They're the only ones who can make an arrest." Nancy giggled, remembering the look on the police captain's face when she'd told him her story. He'd never heard of Nancy Drew, girl detective, and it took 2 phone calls, one to her father and one to Mr. Parton, to make him stop looking angry and start looking amazed. Once he got over his amazement, though, the captain had been more than willing to go along with Nancy's plan. It was a simple plan, really. Daryl had called Mitch Dillon and told him he had an incriminating tape and set up a meeting with him for Monday afternoon at 5:30. At that meeting, Daryl would make sure that Mitch talked about murdering Jake Webb. The best part of the plan was that Nancy and her friends were going to get the confession on videotape using a hidden camera. As Ned drove towards Bedford High, Nancy checked her watch. In a few hours, the case would be over, she hoped. The thought of having to wait out the entire day in school was driving her crazy, but she wanted to keep an eye on Daryl and make sure he didn't bolt. She didn't think he would, but she couldn't take that chance. "Now remember," Ned joked as he pulled the car to a stop, "don't lose your lunch money and don't cut any classes." "Very funny," Nancy said. "How about if we trade places? You go to school and I'll scout around the meeting place." "No thanks, but I will make a deal with you." Ned leaned over and put his hand on the back of her neck. "You behave in school and our trip to the mountains will be next weekend. Mom and Dad are dying to get up there. The cabin has a big stone fireplace and it's really cozy on cold nights." "You've got yourself a date." Nancy bent her head and kissed Ned, wondering how she'd ever thought Daryl Gray was exciting. But she had, and she was going to have to deal with that sooner or later. Later, she told herself. She gave Ned another lingering kiss, then hopped out of the car and went into school. If Nancy really had been a student, she would have flunked out for sure. At least 10 times that day, she'd been caught staring out the window instead of taking notes, and her English teacher had come right out and asked her if she'd left her brains at home. "Where is your mind, Miss Drew?" Nancy was tempted to tell him that her mind was on blackmail, espionage, and murder, but she kept her mouth shut. He would probably have sent her straight to the school psychologist. She saw Daryl twice in the hallway and in the cafeteria, and he seemed fine. Nervous, but ready to go, he said. Nancy was nervous, too, and edgy with waiting, but knowing that Daryl was holding up okay made her relax a little. The next time she saw him was at the meeting place, a public park near Bedford High. She'd joined Ness, Bed, Alan, and George there as soon as school was out. Ned had been exploring the park most of the afternoon, finding the best place to conceal the camera. He was showing Nancy some heavy shrubs that looked perfect when Daryl came running up to them. Nancy glanced at his face and felt her heart begin to sink. Daryl looked terrified. "It's Mitch. Daryl gasped for breath. "He called me at school, pretended to be my father. We can't go through with this." "Why not?" Nancy asked. "What did he say?" "He said he can't make it at 5:30, Daryl told her. "I don't know if he suspects anything, but he's going to be here in 10 minutes. There's no time to let the police in on the change of plans." Nancy felt a moment of panic herself, but in just a few seconds that panic changed to anger. "Look," she said, "maybe he does suspect something. He wouldn't be a very good spy if he didn't keep his eyes open. But he can't possibly have any idea about what we've got in store for him. We can't just give up. He could be planning to leave the country or something. This might be our last chance to get him." "Nancy's right," Ned said quietly. "Besides, if Daryl doesn't show, then Mitch will definitely suspect something." It was too late to try and do any more persuading. Nancy just looked at Daryl, silently urging him to hang in. Daryl stared at the ground a few seconds, considering. Then he raised his head and nodded at Nancy. "Let's go, Detective." As calmly as if they had an entire police force waiting in the wings, the 6 young people took their places. Bess and her rock star-to-be sat close together on one of the park benches, their arms around each other. They didn't have to pretend to be in love, Nancy noticed. Nancy, Ned, and George concealed themselves behind the shrubs where they could film the encounter without being seen. Nancy panned the camera over the park, stopping on Daryl for a few moments. Daryl was sitting on another bench, some distance away from the young lovers. Nancy had been worried about him before, but as she looked at him now, the worry vanished. He was lounging casually on the bench, idly scanning one of his school books, looking as calm and relaxed as the day she'd first seen him at the stoplight in Bedford. "He's pretty cool," George commented softly. Nancy nodded. "He really missed his calling. He should have been an actor." A branch was poking her in the ear. She reached up to push it away and felt Ned's hand close over hers. She smiled and started to say something, but just then Ned's eyes shifted from her face and she felt him tense. "Company," he whispered. Through the camera lens, Nancy watched a heavy-set man stroll into the park. He was wearing jeans and a dark blue windbreaker, and as he stopped by the duck pond, he brought out a handful of popcorn from his pocket and threw it into the water. He didn't hurry or glance around. He was simply a man taking a late afternoon walk through the park. Just one thing set him apart and made Nancy's hands begin to sweat: his bushy mustache. It was the same mustache she'd seen on Jake's tape, and he was the same man who'd met Daryl in front of the defense plant. It was Mitch Dillon, spy, killer, and soon-to-be convicted criminal, if everything went the way Nancy hoped it would. Dillon stopped feeding the ducks, and as he walked along the curved path at the edge of the pond, Nancy could tell that he wasn't as oblivious to his surroundings as most people would have thought. His eyes roved constantly over the park, looking for signs of a trap. As he glanced over the shrubs where the camera crew was hidden, Nancy instinctively held her breath, even though she knew he couldn't see her. Then Dillon took a drink from the water fountain, and when he straightened up, he gave the surroundings one last look. Seemingly satisfied, he wiped his mustache and began a slow amble towards Daryl. Nancy gripped the camera tightly, holding it steady as Dillon eased himself down on the bench beside his contact. Nancy saw Dillon's lips move. Then Daryl nodded, reached into his book bag, and pulled out a bulky envelope. It wasn't the incriminating tape, of course. It was blank. Daryl didn't hand it over right away, though. Instead, he started talking, and Nancy knew he was talking about Jake Webb. "Keep talking," she urged Daryl silently. "Get that murder confession out of Dillon and onto that mini cassette you're wearing under your shirt." Nancy hated being where she was, out of earshot, looking at the scene through a tiny lens. She wanted to be where the action was, hearing everything for herself. It was frustrating being so out of it. She toyed with the idea of giving the camera to George or Ned and sneaking through the bushes until she was closer to Daryl and Dillon, but she decided it wasn't worth the chance. One false move, one too many twigs snapping under feet, could blow it, and she couldn't afford to blow it, especially without the police to back her up. Dillon reached for the envelope then, but Daryl didn't let go. He was still talking. That must have meant that Dillon hadn't said anything about Jake's murder. Nancy wondered why. Could something have gone wrong? Was Daryl being so obvious that Dillon suspected something? Keeping the camera steady, Nancy looked away from the viewfinder for a second. Maybe a real look would tell her something. But before she could see anything, a blinding flash of light went off in the bushes in front of the park bench. Nancy stared long enough to see Mitch Dillon leap up from the bench, the envelope in his hands. Then she dropped the video camera and began running. Something had gone wrong, and Dillon was on his feet. Nancy had to stop him before he got away.